Hello and welcome to our ongoing study of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And today we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 32, as Jesus talks about marriage, divorce, and adultery. So let's start on that last note. Here's a question for you, a serious question. And I hope you won't be defensive. I hope you'll take it in the right way. But the question is this. Have you ever committed adultery? Well, if Jesus were there in the first century, and his people listening to him were Jewish and men, and he were to ask that question to them, they would probably go look at one another and say, no, not me, not me. And then Jesus, in the way that he is able to do, would say, really? Well, I'm telling you that more than likely you have. Well, more than likely we have too. And we'll discover that as we look at Jesus' words. So we look in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, where Jesus talks about this. He talks about temptation, and he talks about how we need to guard our hearts and our minds. This is what he says in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. So he's talking to Jewish people at this time, and he's telling them what they already know, which is the seventh commandment, do not commit adultery. And they, listening, would say, yes, we believe that that commandment is true and valid. We know what it says, and we know that somebody who does that, commits adultery, is subject to judgment. That would have been their conclusion. And that's basically what Jesus is saying in verse 27. Then we look at verse 28. He says, but I, and the I is emphasized. It's not but I, it's but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is saying, you break that commandment not just by an outward act of sexual relationship with a person that you're married to, but also by your lustful look, by your sexual fantasies. Now, that was first century. Here we are in the 2021, and we know that in North America, the temptation to that lustful look and sexual fantasies, well, it's just so much more present. D.A. Carson ends with a question that we're going to raise in a moment, but this is his statement first. He says this, our advertisements, he's talking about we people who live in North America, sell by sexual titillation. True, isn't it? Sex sells. You're on a bus, you're going along, there's a bus shelter, and there's a woman with not too many clothes on, okay? Uncloudily dressed. And that's all around us, on TV as well. He goes on, our bookstores fill the racks with both the salacious and the perverted. Again, I recall as a young boy, many, many years ago, this book called Playboy. Well, if you wanted to get Playboy back then, you had to ask the clerk because he had it behind him and you just couldn't take it off the shelf. Go into a bookstore nowadays, you don't have to ask anything for that, it's right there. He goes on to say, the vast majority of pop songs focus on man-woman relations usually in terms of satisfying sex, physical desire, infidelity, and the like. Well, when I read that, I couldn't help but think of a song that I like. I like the tune of it. It's actually been around for a long time. I didn't know that. I guess I started hearing it 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. It's called Me and Mrs. Jones. And I just like the way it's sung. I never listened to words. I just listened to sort of like the melody, and it had a nice melody to it. And then about a year or two ago, I actually listened to the words. And these are the words of this song that I like listening to on the radio. Me and Mrs. Jones, we got a thing going on. We both know that it's wrong, but it's much too strong to let it go. We meet every day at the same cafe, 6:30, and no one knows that we're there, holding hands, making all kinds of plans while the jukebox plays our favorite songs. We gotta be extra careful that we don't build our hopes up too high, because she's got her own obligations. She's married, and so do I. And I'm married. The song that I like so much to listen to because I like the melody is a song about adultery, a song about adultery. It's so insidious the way these things come to us, and it's all around us. He goes on, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's what Jesus said. And interestingly, when Carson wrote these words about how this temptation is there, this was in 1978 that he wrote them. How much more today are we tintillated? Carson continues, I write this line with shame. Which one of us is not guilty of adultery? This is what adultery is. The lustful look, the entertaining of sexual relations in your mind with a person that we're not married to. If that's what it is, then which of us isn't guilty? And Jesus says, kingdom people who belong to the kingdom of heaven, must take drastic action. He says this, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Well, a churchman named Origen, back in the 3rd century, took these words so seriously that he castrated himself. He really did, because he didn't want to commit adultery. The ironic part is, even a castrated person can commit adultery if it's in your mind as well. And what Jesus is saying here is not really literally to cut off your hand or gouge out your eye, but to take this seriously and to do what you needed to do in order to avoid the lustful look. So from adultery, Jesus moves on to divorce. And this is what he says in verse 31. It has been said. So he's not saying it, but this is what his hearers are known to have heard. Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Now, that's the passage we want to be concerned with, but it's so brief that we're actually going to look at another passage in Matthew that speaks to the same subject. It goes over the same territory, but in a little bit more expansive way. And that would be in Matthew chapter 19. So if you have your Bible there and you want to turn to it, this is what it says in chapter 19 and verse 3. Some Pharisees, these religious leaders, came to him to test him. They are always wanting to test Jesus. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Maybe they were trying to trap him because they knew that there were two schools of thought regarding divorce that were very prevalent. There was one led by the Rabbi Shammai, which said, no, only in very restricted ways can you actually get a divorce. Something very serious has to happen. And then there was another camp that was led by a rabbi whose name was Hillel. And his was very liberal. For almost any reason, a man could divorce his wife. And remember, we're talking about a culture now where women did not divorce their husbands. They didn't have that right. But men could divorce their wives, or at least it had been happening then. And Hillel said, yeah, they can divorce for any reason. So they're saying, okay, Jesus, tell us, where do you come down on this? And Jesus did what he often does. He doesn't answer directly, but he puts a question to them. And here's the question. He says, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? So rather than talk about divorce, Jesus takes them back to Genesis. In fact, this is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, where it says, Jesus made man, male and female. He created them. And said, verse 5, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. That's Genesis 2:24. And in pointing them back to Genesis, what Jesus is doing is he's saying a couple of things here. He's saying, first of all, divorce isn't a matter that God had plans for. God's plan was for marriage. And the second thing is that marriage is of God. So this whole institution that we call marriage is God's plan. And what was God's plan? That a man and a woman would come together, they would leave their family homes and cleave to each other, and they would become one flesh. One in spirit, one in soul, but also one physically. And what God has put together, this is from God, when two people come together like this, let nobody try to separate. How did the Pharisees respond? Verse 7. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Remember, back in Matthew 5, talking about the certificate of divorce? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you. So the Pharisees are saying that Moses demanded or commanded that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce. And Jesus is saying, no, he didn't command. He permitted you to divorce your wife because of your hardness of heart. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. So this certificate of divorce. We find it in Deuteronomy chapter 24. It's not the easiest thing to understand, but it sort of works like this. Here's a man, and he wants to divorce his wife. Well, if he wants to divorce his wife, Deuteronomy says he must give her a certificate of divorce, a piece of paper that says that he is divorcing her. Now she has that piece of paper. So when she goes off now, if she marries another man, and women are inclined to do that because in that society, how are they going to support themselves? Well, if the second man divorces her, or if he dies, then because she has that certificate of divorce, the first man, the husband, cannot remarry her. What's all that about? Well, it seems to be about this. It seems to be about giving the wife some sort of protection. She's going off not in some way that she'll be seen as a prostitute or a loose woman, but she actually has that certificate that her husband gave her. That's one thing. The other thing is it may slow down. It may cause men to think twice before divorcing their wife. So there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot that's been written on it. It's not really important that we understand it fully because Jesus is setting it aside and saying that was never God's will from the beginning anyway. Marriage was God's will. But then he concludes by saying that if you divorce your wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marry another, then you commit adultery. Well, even in this passage, there's some uncertainty. Those people who know the Greek words say the word that's translated as marital unfaithfulness here, it could mean a couple of different things. But what it seems to say, and what most people agree about this, but not everybody, is that adultery is a cause for divorce. That if your spouse commits adultery, you don't have to divorce her, but you do have just cause for it. Well, let's talk now about some of the lessons that we might learn from this. And even as we do so, I'm reminded that viewing this are people from many different backgrounds. There are some who are single and have always been single. There are some who are single because they've been divorced. There are some who are single because their spouse has died. Watching this at this very moment are married people. And there are people who are divorced. And there are people watching this who are divorced and have been remarried. So there are a lot of different situations, and I might not even have described your situation. So right off the top, what I want to say is we're going to look at these things, these lessons here, and weigh them seriously, but always, if you're ever making a decision about your situation, make sure you do it taking these matters seriously, but also talking to a mature believer, talking to your pastor or somebody else to help you to sort through what your situation happens to be. Having said that, what are some of the life lessons that we have? Well, the first is this. Marriage is an honorable estate. Jesus said that. He said it's from God. But so also is singleness. Being single is. The Apostle Paul, being more pastoral, says some things that Jesus doesn't say, and he says them more in the line of being a pastor trying to address certain situations. And one of the things that he makes clear is that singleness, being single is actually a good thing. This is what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And please refer to that chapter after all of this is over and read it carefully. This is what he says. He says, "Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am." So if you're not married, stay unmarried. If you're widowed and you can do it, then stay single. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So a single person has to have control over that sexual appetite that all people are born with. He goes on to say in verses 32 to 34, "I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband." So this is Paul's logic. He's saying, if you're single, then you can just be for the Lord wholeheartedly. Body, soul, spirit, every possible way. But if you're married, you want to please the Lord, but you also have to think about your wife and all of her needs. And if you're a woman, then you want to please the Lord, but you have to think about your husband and pleasing him. So you have less responsibility towards another person if you're not married. And therefore you can give yourself entirely to the Lord. So he's saying being single is a good thing. Bottom line, whichever way that we're called in life, to be single or married, it should be done very carefully, and with much prayer. Second thing is, marriage is a serious matter and should not be undertaken lightly. It means committing yourself to one person, body, soul, for life. This is the marriage liturgy that I have used over the years. I've officiated at many weddings. And what happens at the very beginning of the ritual is that the man and the woman about to be married are standing in front of you. And as a pastor, this is what I read to them. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and the presence of these witnesses to join these people in holy matrimony. Marriage is an honorable estate instituted by God in the time of creation." That's what it says in Genesis. "For the well-being of mankind. Marriage is a union close and enduring, a relationship in which a man and a woman forsake all others to become one flesh." Genesis. "This abiding union, marriage, is therefore not to be entered into by any lightly, but reverently, soberly, and in the fear of God." That's pretty heavy, but that it should be heavy, because these two people are about to commit themselves in a very serious way. In fact, the next thing that happens is, as a pastor, I ask them to repeat after me. I ask them this question: will you have this woman to be your wedded wife, to live together in the holy estate of matrimony? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep yourself only for her so long as you both shall live? From this moment on, physical intimacy. Just with your wife, just with your husband, nobody else. That is what you are committing yourself to. Thirdly, believers should marry believers. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39 says this. It says, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. So if your marriage is for life, but if your spouse dies, then you are free to marry. But this is what it says. But he must belong to the Lord. In other words, he must be a Christian. You're a Christian, you marry a Christian. You're a believer, you marry a believer. Why is that so important? Well, it's important because of the principle of oneness. You want to be together physically, emotionally, but also spiritually. You, as a believer, are living under the lordship of Christ. He is your guide. You want to live your life to please him. But your spouse, who is an unbeliever, isn't living for the Lord. He's living for other reasons. And so you're not really united in that way. So we then, therefore, are to marry someone who is a believer. So, what happens then? Well, sometimes people are married to an unbeliever. How? Sometimes through disobedience. You're a believer. The person you're thinking about marrying is not a believer. You know that you shouldn't marry them, but you go forward and do it anyway. You've been disobedient. And sometimes you're married to an unbeliever, not because you planned it, because that's the way it worked out. You and your spouse started off life both as unbelievers. So you're an unbeliever married to an unbeliever. And then you became a believer. Well, now, in becoming a believer, your spouse is still an unbeliever. You are married to an unbeliever. What should you do in that case? Well, again, Paul gives some pastoral advice in chapter 7 in verses 12 to 16. This is what he says. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. It doesn't mean, when it says that they're sanctified through you, it doesn't mean that they're believers or that they're saved. What it means is that you are a channel of salvation to them. You are a connection, if you like, between them and God. And your life, your belief, is a way blessing your spouse. But then he goes on. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. So if your spouse, an unbeliever, this is what happened. You started off with both as unbelievers. You became a believer. He stayed as an unbeliever. If he wants to stay and be a part of that marriage, good. But if he wants to leave because you're a believer now, then Paul says, let him. Adultery is violation of marriage. The obvious case is physical adultery, where your spouse is having a relationship other than with yourself, a physical relationship. But what about Mrs. Brown and her companion? They may never have had a physical relationship. It talks about them meeting at 6:30 together each day, but certainly they have given themselves emotionally to each other. And in that sense, they have broken the one flesh principle. They are no longer committed to their spouse, but they are committed to each other. So we then say that adultery is a sufficient but not necessary reason for divorce. It's not necessary. If your spouse commits adultery, it doesn't mean that you have to divorce him. Go for counseling. It's not going to be easy. But there have been couples that have worked through it. They've worked through it, and they've come out of it having a marriage. So it's not necessary to divorce your husband, but it is sufficient. There's some debate in this area. I'll grant you that. But the overwhelming thought is that adultery is the sufficient ground for divorce. Your spouse commits adultery, then you have the right, if you like, for a divorce. And what would be the logic? Once again, adultery violates the one flesh principle. You and your spouse have come together and you've committed yourself to be one, and your spouse, by committing adultery, has allowed somebody else to come between you. We all, married or single, need to guard our hearts and our eyes. We need to be careful. We need to see that we don't allow ourselves to be open to get into an emotional relationship with another person. And if we're men, then we especially have to guard our eyes, because that's what men are like. Men are physiologically different than women. Men see things with their eyes that titillate. And so for men especially, we have to be careful as to what we watch. And then women, what can you do? Well, John Stott, in his commentary on this subject, doesn't leave you out. This is the way, what he says, and maybe we'll end on this point. He says, this is what he says: similarly, whenever men and women have learned sexual self-control, indeed, it is because they have first learned it in the eyes of both flesh and fantasy. This may be an appropriate moment to refer in passing to the way girls dress. It would be silly to legislate about fashions, but wise, I think, to ask them to make this distinction. It is one thing to make yourself attractive. And what woman doesn't want to make herself attractive? It is another to make yourself deliberately seductive. You girls know the difference. So do we men. Good cautionary note to end on. Well, I want to end finally, though, on this note. We've looked at what the scripture says here in Matthew, in a couple of places, and then also in Corinthians. Not just Jesus' clear statements on these matters, but also Paul's pastoral advice in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But be honest, there are a lot of questions that are asked on this subject, and they're not all answered pastorally in chapter 7. So if you have a question about your situation, which you might, and that question has not been addressed in what we've talked about today, or you're not clear about it, then definitely do your own research, read the scripture, take the scripture seriously, talk to your pastor, and talk to other mature believers so that you can really get some wisdom on this subject. And then if you need to act or do something, you'll do it in accordance with what God would want you to do. God be with you.